Ohana, Dr. Bear here, on the frontier of the mind, the frontier of imagination. Come with me into the forest of mystic awareness, mystic awakening.
Hitch a ride on the wild side.
Hitch a ride on the wild side.
Take a ride on the wild side.
Take a ride on the wild side.
You in the forest of Mauitopia, here on the west side, where the trees are like beings, each of which have something to teach, something to say. I'm reminded of the words of Henry David Thoreau, the great transcendentalist, who once wrote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to suck out all the marrow of life, and not when I come to die, discover that I'd never actually lived. Because living," he would say, "is so dear. Living is so dear." And it's a wonder that we don't seem to be able to adjust ourselves to the physical environment without destroying it. Why is it that, in a way, our culture represents, in a unique fashion, the law of diminishing returns, that our success is a failure, that we are holding up, in other words, an enormous technological civilization which seems to promise the fulfillment of every wish almost at the touch of a button. And yet, as in so many fairy tales, when the wishes finally materialize, they're like fairy gold. They're not really material at all. In other words, so many of our problems, our cars, our homes, our food, it looks as if it were really the instant creation of pure thought. That is to say, it is thoroughly insubstantial, lacking in what the connoisseur of wine calls body. And, in other words, the riches are illusory. And with that, we're totally frustrated. We feel that the only thing to go on is more emptiness and getting more. And as a result of that, the whole landscape begins to look like this nursery of a spoiled child who's gotten too many toys and throws them away as fast as they can get them after playing with them for just a few moments. We're also dedicated to a war on the basic material dimensions of time and space. We want to obliterate their limitations over us. We want to get everything done as fast as possible. We want to convert the rhythms and skills of work into cash, which indeed you can buy something with, but you can't eat it. And then we rush home to get away from work and begin the real business of life, to enjoy ourselves. You know, for the vast majority of Americans, I think there seems to be the real point of life, which is what you rush home to get to, is to watch an electronic reproduction of life. You can't touch it, and it doesn't smell, it has no taste. You might think that people who are getting on with the real point of life in this vast material culture would go home to a colossal banquet, or an orgy of lovemaking, or a riot of music and dancing, but nothing of the kind. Turns out to be this purely passive, contemplative obsession with a twittering screen. You see mile after mile of darkened houses with that little electronic screen flickering away. Everybody isolated, watching this thing, and thus feeling no real communion with each other at all. Now, this isolation of people to a private world of their own is really the creation of a mindless crowd. And so, we don't feel each other, or get with each other except in public expressions of hostility like football or prize boxing. And even in the spectacle of sport, it's perfectly proper to exhibit people slugging and slaying each other, but no loving, except in a rather restrained way, which means that there is the assumption underlying this that expressions of physical love are far more dangerous than expressions of physical hatred. And it seems that a culture that has that assumption is basically crazy and devoted intentionally, or unintentionally rather, but nevertheless wholeheartedly devoted not to surviving, but to the act of destroying life. But we must remember the words of the great poet Walt Whitman, who said, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large and I contain multitudes." Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large and I contain multitudes.
Hitch a ride on the wild side.
Hitch a ride on the wild side.
Take a ride